How do you know that your life makes a difference after you die? And how far are you willing to go to find out? When I was a little kid, I was absolutely fascinated by Harry Houdini. I would go to the school history fair dressed up as Houdini with handcuffs behind my back and escape in front of parents and teachers while I described the life and work of the magician and performer and escape artist. I read every book I could get my hands on about the man, and at home I had my own little magic kit and routine, and my parents would tie my hands up with rope and my legs and throw me in the closet to see if I could escape. 2 or 3 times I actually did. One of the greatest tricks that Houdini ever tried to perform, the greatest escape act, was one that happened long after he died. This man tried to see if he could escape even death itself. So when his mom died, he was devastated. He loved her with a fierce passion. He came from a family of Jewish Eastern European immigrants. They were a poor family, and when he made it big here and made the big money, he wanted to pay her back. And so he bought her a dress that was made for the Queen of England herself, but never used. He bought his mom a house in Harlem where he and his wife and mother lived. And she died one night after the stroke of midnight. And so, at midnight, every night for weeks, Harry Houdini would go out into the graveyard where his mother was buried, lie down on the cool earth in front of her headstone, stretch out his entire body and place his face on the earth and talk to his mom. He even said that when he was buried, he wanted his head to rest on a pillow filled with her letters. So his therapist might have a little bit to say about this. However, you will understand when I tell you that when someone approached him and said that they wanted to invite him to a seance where he could talk to his mother, he was intrigued. So the spiritualist movement was on the rise again in America at this time. The ability or the idea that people could contact the dead was coming up in American culture because so many people had lost loved ones in the First World War. Seances were on the rise and happening all over the United States, and a lot of them looked like you might imagine, the stereotypes of a crystal ball and a floating table and disembodied voices. But Houdini was a magician. He knew all of the tricks and how all of this was done, and so he wasn't buying any of it. However, his best friend, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was. And so when they were on vacation together one time, he rented a room and hired someone who said they could contact Houdini's dead mother. Now, this seance was a hoax from the very beginning, and Houdini knew it. He could see right through every single one of the tricks, and all of the answers that his mother was supposedly whispering on from the grave were completely wrong. But he sat quietly and patiently through the whole thing. Afterward, he wrote a series of letters to American newspapers saying how offended he was that people in a deep moment of grief were being taken advantage of by tricksters and charlatans just trying to make $1 off of somebody's pain. And so he devoted the last chapter of his life to debunking the spiritualist movement. He would host big public performances for thousands of people where he would show how the tricks were done one by one and give away all the secrets. He took on big names in the industry in person, one by one. But being the ultimate showman, he decided that his last trick, his last escape, would be death itself. And so the night before he died, on Halloween night, 1926, he gave his wife Bess a secret code. A code that he promised he would whisper back to her if he could after he died. The secret code that he would whisper back was, "Rosabelle, believe." And so on the anniversary of his death, for 10 years, on Halloween night, his wife Bess would host this seance, get all their friends together, and wait to hear her husband whisper back, "Rosabelle, believe." But it never happened. They had kept a candle lit on the mantelpiece for 10 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since his death. And on that night, she walked over to the mantelpiece, she snuffed out the light and said the words, 10 years is long enough to wait for any man. She's probably right. But I remember as a kid, I was intrigued that this man who knew the secrets to all the tricks, the cynic and skeptic, would set his cynicism down for just a night to see if maybe he could talk to his mom. I'm as skeptical as anybody else, but I get the impulse. He just wanted to see if perhaps something of us lingers on in a tangible way. If we can whisper on after we're gone, if we get to feel the impact of someone whose life touched ours in that way. I'm a skeptic when it comes to these things, but I do have a confession to make to you. Even though she's been dead for 20 years, sometimes I smell my grandmother. See, she had an oversized influence in my life, kind of like Houdini's mom. But it was one that I didn't understand until long after she was dead and I was an adult. She was the only person I knew growing up who went to college. She stayed in college well into her 60s. She was the odd duck in our family. All I ever wanted to be as a kid was a grown-up. That's it. And she would let me go to her house and sit in her kitchen, and she would make me decaf coffee and let me drink it and pretend. Her house smelled like old books and coffee, and it had the sounds of public radio on in the background. I can remember one morning in the early fall, kind of like this day, sitting in the back room of her house watching the light stream in through the window, and I put on a record of an old comedy routine about Noah and the ark. I just sat there laughing to myself about how silly we are when we try to make meaning. So back to my confession. She's been dead for 20 years, but sometimes I smell my grandma. And I don't mean something that reminds me of her, a scent that kind of is like her. I smell her. It's a distinct combination of coffee, old books, and Chanel No. 5. And it's powerful when it happens. I can remember the first time it happened. I was out on a date with my now wife, Kate. We were dating at the time. We were teenagers, and we had gone down to Dallas to get dressed up and go out to a fancy dinner and a romantic night. We were waiting to be seated, and I jumped up all of a sudden and said, "Oh my God, I can smell my dead grandmother." Which, if you're interested, is a really terrible way to set a romantic evening. However, it was palpable. It was like she was standing over my shoulder, just whispering back to me. Like she was right there. I smelled her that day, and on the day of my graduation from Austin College, and on the day I graduated from seminary. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how it happens. I can't explain it. But it's really powerful when it does. Now, maybe we don't live on like seances and crystal balls, and maybe that's not my grandmother whispering to me. But there is some recent scientific evidence that suggests that we pass on a lot more than we think. That perhaps we are able to pass on memories in our genes, to take from our ancestors and give to those after us what we love and fear. The magic word in this case is epigenetics. The basic theory is that many of our genes come equipped with a little switch, and it turns on or off based on your life experience and then conveys a little more information to the next generation. Some researchers at Emory University in 2013 published a study which suggests that we might be able to transmit the memory of trauma in our bodies to our children and grandchildren. What they did was take mice who had never been outside the lab and expose them to the scent of cherry blossoms and then shock them immediately. And then cherry blossoms and then a shock. And then cherry blossoms and a shock over and over again until when these mice smelled cherry blossoms, they began to exhibit a trauma response. Think a shaking body, trembling with fear, stress hormones pumping through the veins of their tiny organs and bodies. And then those researchers took the children of those mice who had never met their parents. They hadn't sat around the fire telling stories. They had never been shocked, and they had never smelled cherry blossoms. And when the children of those mice smelled cherry blossoms for the first time, they began to shake. Their stress hormones were pumping. Their bodies were trembling as if they had been present for the trauma themselves. And like magic, it also happened to their children. The grandchildren of the original mice responding with their bodies as if the memory of a trauma they never experienced was alive and well in them. The implications of that are astounding to me. If the DNA and the genes in those mice can do it, I wonder if it's possible for us. Think of the implications for communities who have suffered under generational trauma over and over again. Think of what happens in the bodies of people who experience institutionalized racism or oppression, for example. What coded memory and trauma is alive and well in the bodies of the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of enslaved or oppressed people? What on earth are we passing on? It makes me wonder if perhaps the genes in those mice, and maybe in us, figured out how to perform the greatest magic trick that Houdini never could. Every year they whisper their secret code on, and it shows up in the very bodies and bones and blood of their children's children's children, informing what we fear and love. Like they're whispering back, Rosabelle, believe, just more subtle. For me, it is not cherry blossoms. It's coffee and old books and Chanel No. 5. I found out only after I was ordained and long after my grandmother was dead that she was an ordained minister, and nobody had told me. I found out that she went to seminary just down the street from where I work, and I drive past her school every single morning. I found out that she did her internship in San Angelo, Texas, a town I had never heard of until I married a woman who was born there. Now it's my house that smells like old books and coffee. It's my house that has the sound of public radio in the background. It's my family that sits and laughs and cries at stories of how human beings are so weird and fragile when we're trying to make meaning. We might not live on in the same way that Houdini thought we might. But to me, it's even more magical than that. No tricks, just mystery, written into our very genes. One of the most important questions you ever get to ask while you are alive is, does this matter? Does what I do make a difference? Will anybody remember me? Will my impact on the world last longer than my life? And the answer to that question is absolutely 100% yes. Not only do your actions matter and make a difference, but the pain that you help liberate people from, or the pain that you perpetuate, might actually live on in the body and the blood and the bones of people you'll never meet. 70 years from now, someone might stand in a moment of awe or feel peace or love. They might feel a chill run down their spine or shudder with terror. Perhaps informed by the way that you or the system you live in treated their grandmother. I don't know what to do with that information. It sounds magical and empowering and frightening if we have that much power. Do we live forever? I have no idea. I have never been dead. At least that I know of. I don't know if we speak to one another in those ways or whether something of us whispers on like that. I have no idea if that's my grandmother behind me or if that's just my neurons firing or maybe both. But I do know that whether you bear biological children or not, your legacy will live on maybe in the genetics of people you'll never meet. I know that you don't get to choose whether your life has an impact because it will. We don't really even get to choose if our life lives on longer than we do. How you live will inform how a generation of people fear and love the world. We don't get to choose if our life lives on longer than us. but we do get to decide what impact we will have. So let's make it a worthy one while we have time. Thank you.